On November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 into orbit around the Earth. On board was a small dog named Laika. The mission was a success, but it came at a great cost. So let's find out why. It was October 1957, and Laika had no idea that she would become the first living creature to journey into outer space. She was just a stray dog from the streets of Moscow who had been captured by Soviet authorities and taken to a secret research facility outside the city. There she was, trained for her new mission. And although her life was now regimented, her new home wasn't too bad. She had plenty of food and human companionship, something she hadn't known much of on the streets. But soon the scientists would begin to make the small dog's living quarters more like a spaceship. They wanted her to get used to the cramped conditions. And then one day, they brought in a mock-up of the type of space capsule that she would fly in. For the next 2 weeks, the scientists monitored her behavior, making sure she was adjusting well to life in a space vehicle. Then, on October, after passing all of her tests, she was transferred to the real thing. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in the United States, 2 rhesus monkeys named Ham and Enos were also being trained for spaceflight. Now, while the Soviets were sending dogs into space, the Americans were sending monkeys. And these 2 particular monkeys had already made history. They were part of Project Hermes, which was trying to send a living creature into space and bring them back alive. This would be much harder than just sending an animal into space and letting it die. But both Ham and Enos had passed all of their tests with flying colors and were now just waiting for their big day. Now, on November, Laika boarded her space capsule in the same way that Ham and Enos had done. A special elevator would lift the capsule and its canine passenger high above the ground and attach it to the top of a powerful Soviet rocket. As the workers finished their preparations, Laika barked nervously. Soon it was time. She was strapped into her spacesuit, and then the hatch was closed. The little dog whined as she heard the sounds of technicians backing away from the rocket. Moments later, the powerful engines roared to life and shook the ground beneath her feet. Then the rocket began to rise slowly at first, then faster and faster until it was moving so quickly that the G-forces pressed her down into her seat. Soon the noise and shaking stopped, and Laika found herself floating inside the tiny space capsule. Startled, she quickly began to explore her new surroundings. Soon, she found a water container and drank eagerly. Next, she sniffed at her food, but the space environment made it hard to eat, so she quickly lost interest. As the hours passed, she became bored and started to wander around the capsule. She pressed against the windows and looked back at the Earth. At this point, she had completed the first part of her mission. The Soviets had successfully put a living creature into orbit around the Earth. But unfortunately, her joy wouldn't last long. Although the Soviets claimed that Laika lived happily for several days in orbit, this is most likely not true. While her food and water supplies lasted, she probably floated around her space capsule, happily exploring and taking in the sights. But her water supply only lasted a couple of days, and when it ran out, she was doomed. Without water, she could only survive for a few more days. During those last days, she probably felt sick from the recycled air inside the capsule and was weak from lack of food. Finally, she died. Meanwhile, Ham and Enos never experienced this fate because their mission didn't last nearly as long as Laika's. The United States didn't want to put another animal in a situation where it would have to die in space. So Ham and Enos only orbited the Earth once before their capsule parachuted back to Earth and landed in the ocean. There, a recovery team was waiting to pull the 2 monkeys from the wreckage and take them off to be examined by scientists. As the Americans checked over Ham and Enos, they realized that they had made history. These 2 monkeys were the first primates ever to survive a trip into space. Laika may have died during her mission, but she had also made history. Her sacrifice allowed the Soviets to learn a lot about how a living creature's body reacts to spaceflight. But there was still a lot of work to do if they wanted to send a human into space and bring them back safely. First, they needed to perfect the spacecraft. Sputnik 2 was a relatively simple space capsule. It was basically a sphere with some instruments inside and a blunt nose cone. Attached to the bottom of the capsule was a small heat shield. This was all that protected Laika as she plunged through the Earth's atmosphere at a speed of over 17,500 miles per hour. To make sure that future crews would survive re-entry, the Soviets built a new and improved space capsule. This one was called the Vostok 1, and it would be used to carry the first human into space. Of course, the Soviets couldn't use a dog for this mission. They needed a human. But many of the lessons they learned from Laika would help ensure that the first human mission would be successful. For example, the Soviets knew from experience how important it is for a spacecraft to be as comfortable as possible for a living being. In fact, the Vostok 1's design was based heavily on the spacesuits that Laika wore during her historic flight. This meant that the first human to fly in space would have plenty of room to move around. In addition, the Soviets knew that the psychological well-being of an astronaut would be just as important as their physical health. So they made sure that the Vostok 1 had a window so that the crew could see the Earth below them. But perhaps the most important lesson the Soviets learned from Laika was about the dangers of spaceflight. She was the first living creature to orbit the Earth, but she also paid the ultimate price. By launching Sputnik 2 and learning from Laika, the Soviets were able to make spaceflight safer for humans. In fact, Laika's sacrifice is one of the reasons that we have not sent another dog into space since. In the years since Laika's death, she has become a hero of the Soviet Union and a symbol of the power of space exploration. A statue of her stands outside the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and a museum is dedicated to her in her hometown of Ryazan. Now, when we think about spaceflight today, we often think about the amazing views astronauts get to see. When they look out of their spaceship windows, they can see the Earth as a blue marble suspended in the vastness of space. But what would Laika have seen if she had survived her mission? Well, thanks to modern technology, we can actually find out. This image was created by taking photographs of the Earth from the International Space Station and stitching them together to create a seamless view of our planet. What you're seeing is a true color infrared image, which means that the colors are similar to what the human eye can see. The image was then projected onto a 3D model of the Earth to create a realistic view of our planet from space. So if you were floating in a spaceship just like Laika, this is what you would see. Of course, Laika didn't get to enjoy the view for long. After she died, her body was left in orbit around the Earth for several months before it eventually burned up in the atmosphere. But that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy it for her. As we continue to explore space, it's important to remember the animals that have helped us get there. Laika the dog was the first living creature to journey into outer space, and although her mission was a success, it came at a great cost. But thanks to her sacrifice, we have been able to learn more about the amazing animals that we are and the universe that we live in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.